So what I'm going to talk about tonight is going to be U.S. security interest in the Persian Gulf in light of the new Biden administration. I have slides, so I'm gonna share screen for much of this. Okay. Okay. So one thing to note at the outset is, at this point, many people in the United States have what I think you could fairly call Middle East fatigue. It seems like the United States has been involved in these so-called quote unquote forever wars since the US invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11, and then the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. You've had US forces that have been on the ground in both of those places at this point for well over a decade. With respect to the Biden administration, there are other regions of the world that have a higher priority than the Middle East does, notably China and probably Russia as well. There seems to be some sentiment amongst administration watchers that the US might be looking to kind of back away from the Middle East a little bit, that the US has invested too much time and too much money and too many troops into this region, and people are basically just tired and are no longer willing to give it this kind of attention. But the Middle East has a way of sucking people back in again, despite everybody's best desires to perhaps step away a little bit. And the region does remain strategically important to the United States for several reasons. The first, obviously, is because of the enormous oil and natural gas resources that are in the region. Saudi Arabia has more oil than anybody else. They are going to continue to have large oil reserves long after most other states have completely gone through their. And even though the United States isn't reliant on oil from Saudi Arabia or really even oil from the Persian Gulf anymore, it's important to many of our allies. It does ensure, again, thinking ahead several decades, it will still ensure that the United States has access to those resources. The region is important because of the presence of extremists such as the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, many of which recruit heavily in the areas of the Persian Gulf. You have two extremely important shipping lanes on either end of the Persian Gulf, one coming out of the Persian Gulf into the Gulf of Oman, the Strait of Hormuz, which is between Oman and Iran. It's the bottleneck of the Persian Gulf. You don't get ships in or out of the Persian Gulf if you don't go through the Strait of Hormuz. And the other one is the Bab el-Mandab Strait, which is between Djibouti and Yemen. All right, so on the other side of the peninsula. That's another one of these shipping choke points. This is the way you gain entrance to the Red Sea. And of course, the Red Sea takes you to the Suez Canal, which then means you're into the Mediterranean. So those shipping lanes will remain important. But another reason why the United States needs to maintain its interest in the Persian Gulf is because of the US bases that it has in the region. For example, the US Fifth Fleet, right, is headquartered in Bahrain. Right? As you can see, there are about 7,000 American forces that are headquartered in Bahrain. The Al Ubaid Air Base in Qatar is the forward headquarters of the US Combined Air Operations Center. And Qatar actually recently invested $1.8 billion into providing new facilities and upgrades to those facilities at the airbase. And again, about 13,000 American service people are in Qatar. And then in Kuwait, that's where the US Army Central Forward Headquarters is. Its international airport is the US's largest regional air logistics point. Right? And with the CENTCOM airbase in Qatar, this is how the United States gets its forces, for example, to Afghanistan and to Iraq. It has a global reach. And those bases, therefore, mean that the Persian Gulf is critical to American security, even if you're not thinking about the Middle East. With the change in administrations from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, there's going to be a meaningful shift that takes place in American foreign policy, which is already underway, not just in terms of the personalities, but also just in terms of the priorities and the kinds of policies that the administration is likely to implement. In the spring of 2020, before he was elected, Joe Biden published an article in the widely read periodical Foreign Affairs, which laid out his vision for US foreign policy if he was to be elected president. He's also issued statements on October 2nd, on the second anniversary of the murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, and his key members of his administration, Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State, Jake Sullivan as National Security Counsel, Avril Haines as Director of National Intelligence, have already testified at confirmation hearings in Congress, and so we have their statements to look at as well. The Biden administration plans to make democracy, human rights, and anti-corruption priorities again, because all of these things kind of slid off the map while the Trump administration was in power. And Biden has identified 4 key issues that he sees in the Middle East. The first one of those is counterterrorism, which I'm not really going to talk about tonight at all. The second one is maintaining the US's commitment to Israel's security, notably that the US has a commitment to ensure that Israel enjoys a quantitative military edge. And this has an impact for arms sales that the United States might make to states in the Persian Gulf like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. I'm also not really going to talk about Israel. I am going to focus on the next 2 of these key issues for the Biden administration, Iran and Saudi Arabia. The administration has clearly stated that it wants to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. There are a whole host of other issues that are on the table with the Iranians, including their ballistic missile program, human rights abuses by the regime, support for terrorist organizations, and what people politely refer to as Iran's destabilizing activities in the region, which I'll get to in a moment. And then the fourth priority is going to be a reset in the US relationship with Saudi Arabia. Biden has already made clear that he thinks that Saudi Arabia has been coddled by the Trump administration and deserves to be treated more as a global pariah. He wants to center human rights abuses in the US relationship with Saudi Arabia. And then the 2 other aspects of this, and all of these with Saudi Arabia are intimately linked with one another: the war in Yemen, right, as well as arms sales to Saudi Arabia. One overarching theme in the Middle East, or the kind of the backdrop to just about anything that you talk about with respect to the Persian Gulf and really any more the Middle East in general, is this long-standing rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia for regional dominance. I mean, the simplistic way that people think of this is that, the Iranians are Shia, the Saudis are Sunni, and that this is somehow mainly just a religious conflict. It doesn't necessarily break down that easily along those lines. And if you think about the location of Iran and Saudi Arabia, I mean, they are the 2 largest states in the Persian Gulf region. They are directly across from one another. They are 2 of the largest oil producers in the world, or at least Iran was until US sanctions really bit into its ability to export its oil. And they have been playing out this rivalry, this drive for global or regional dominance, rather, in just about every single conflict point you can think of in the Middle East. And I have 5 of the more important ones that are listed here. And you can see that the Iranians and the Saudis basically, it's pretty reliable. If you know which side one of them backs in any given conflict, then you pretty much can guarantee the other side is backing the other side in the conflict. Most of my comments tonight are going to be heavily focused on Yemen. We might touch a little bit on Lebanon, but I'm really not going to address Bahrain, Iraq, or Syria. Although if somebody has questions later, I'd be happy to consider those. Right. So primarily what I am going to focus on this evening is looking at policy towards Iran and Saudi Arabia, the interplay of that, and then how that plays out with respect to Yemen, right? And there are a subset of human rights and humanitarian concerns that underlie all three of those states with respect to U.S. interests. I always enjoy this particular cartoon because it reminds us that for as much as we know that Iran has a dreadful human rights record, we frequently forget that Saudi Arabia's record is every bit as bad as the Iranians, which I will lay out for you in a little while. Okay. So with the transition from the Trump to the Biden administration, you're going to have clearly different approaches to foreign policy. Trump's foreign policies in the Persian Gulf region and really globally were transactional and personal in nature. For example, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, was a close friend of the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. Mohammed bin Salman thought that anytime he needed or wanted something from Washington, he just completely circumvented traditional channels and went around the State Department and would just simply pick up the phone and call Jared Kushner. There were some things that came out of this that were more beneficial for the United States. The advancements in recognition of Israel through the Abraham Accords, an end to the blockade of Qatar, which I'll pick up on again in a minute. But for the most part, this was a very destabilizing way for the United States to pursue policy in this region. There was no role for human rights under the Trump administration. And in fact, Trump cozied up to autocratic leaders throughout the Middle East, in particular, the president of Egypt, al-Sisi, Mohammed bin Salman, and Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey. The administration engaged in a total embrace of the maximalist agenda that is being pursued by Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, and engaged in this so-called maximum pressure campaign on the Iranians. One of the first things that the administration did when it came in, which kind of tips its hand as to what things were going to happen in the Middle East, was the imposition of the Muslim travel ban and the severe cuts that the administration put in place for the ability of refugees. And that includes individuals who served as translators for the US military in Iraq. But the ability of refugees to come into the United States was severely cut. With respect to Iran, one of the most important things that happened, of course, was that the administration withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. This is the Iran nuclear deal. In his final weeks, and actually in some cases his final days in office, the Trump administration took actions which were clearly meant to complicate the Biden administration's policies when it came into office. For example, they approved a $22 billion arms sale to the United Arab Emirates and an additional $800 million in arms to Saudi Arabia. They demonstrated the Houthis, a rebel movement in Yemen, as a foreign terrorist organization. And they slapped the Iranians with even more sanctions than were already on Iran, blacklisting two large corporations that had ties to Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader in Iran, and placing even more restrictions on the sale and shipment of metals, especially steel. All right, so first I want to talk about Iran's nuclear program. Then I'm going to talk about the issue with Saudi Arabia. Okay. So the Biden administration's top priority in the Persian Gulf, and really I think in the Middle East in general, is containing Iran's nuclear program. And the Biden administration thinks that the way to go about doing this is to rejoin the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, which is the 2015 nuclear deal that was negotiated by Obama. And of course, Joe Biden was instrumental in supporting the nuclear deal, so it's unsurprising that he is interested in returning to that. The Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA in May of 2018 and put in place a campaign of what they refer to of maximum pressure on the Iranians. For example, when they withdrew from the JCPOA, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo put out a list of American demands to Iran, what the Americans wanted the Iranians to do if, in fact, the United States was going to lift sanctions. And you can see that this is, an extremely ambitious list. It's just basically asking for the Iranians to completely surrender their foreign policy and do exactly what it is the United States wants them to do. As part of this campaign of maximum pressure, the administration put repeated rounds of new sanctions on the Iranians. And this is on top of the so-called snapback of the sanctions that had been lifted when the JCPOA went into effect. In 2020, there were two major assassinations of leading figures in Iran. Early in the year, it was assassination in Iraq by US forces of Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Revolutionary Guard forces for Iran that operated abroad. And then their top nuclear scientist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, was assassinated in November of 2020. The Israelis have been accused of doing this. The Iranians believe, of course, that Israel did it with the assistance of the United States. After the election in the United States, Trump reportedly had asked his advisors if there were any options that would allow him to strike at Iran's nuclear facilities before he left office. So this would have been a military strike while the administration was a lame duck. His top advisors reportedly were able to talk him out of this. The military said that basically there were really no good military options that would have been on the table. But all of this has really complicated the situation for Joe Biden coming in. Trump's policies with respect to the Iranians basically have failed. If the idea of maximum pressure was to either force the Iranians to renegotiate the JCPOA and provide additional concessions, to stop its interference in regional activities, to curtail its assistance for terrorism, et cetera. I mean, none of these things have happened. If anything, the regime in Tehran is not only still in power, but the hardliners are likely to win the presidential elections that are going to be held in June of 2021. The moderates have been badly discredited by the fact that the United States withdrew from the JCPOA and then just the piling on of these sanctions. The one way actually in which you could say that the maximum pressure campaign succeeded was that it has inflicted enormous economic pain on the Iranians. Unfortunately, most of that is being borne by just the ordinary population and not by the regime itself. Iran's regional activities have not been curtailed. If anything, its position is stronger in Yemen, in Syria, and in Iraq than it was when the Trump administration took office. And most importantly, the Iranians are closer to a nuclear weapon than they were before the JCPOA was put into place. When the administration withdrew, the Iranians waited for a year. But when it became clear that the United States was not going to lift any of its sanctions, it slowly began to exceed the limits that had been imposed on it by the JCPOA. And recently, earlier this, well, it's not January anymore, in early of January of 2021, the Iranians announced that they were going to begin to enrich uranium to 20% again. The reason why this is important, beyond just the fact that it's a clear violation of the JCPOA, the Iranians are limited to no more than 3.67% enrichment of uranium. It's that once you get to 20% enriched uranium, there very little additional effort is needed to get to 90%, which is weapons grade uranium. And the International Atomic Energy Agency said in a report that they issued in November of 2020 that Iran's uranium stockpiles were now over 2,400 kilograms. The JCPOA had limited the Iranians to about 300 kilograms for 15 years. And as you can see in this graph, in fact, the Iranians stuck with that through 2019. So in other words, for an entire year after the administration had withdrawn from the JCPOA. But in the aftermath of the assassination of the nuclear scientist Fakhrizadeh in November of 2020, the Iranian parliament passed a law that would called for the enrichment of uranium to 20%, and furthermore called for the restriction of IAEA access as of the end of February 2021. One of the last things the Trump administration did before it left office was to slap additional sanctions onto the Iranians. One of the things about this is that many of these went into effect literally the day before the Biden administration was able to come into, came into office. According to a leading international think tank, the International Crisis Group, the maximum pressure era has, they said, produced the worst of all worlds, economic stagnation for the Iranians, mounting international concern over its nuclear program, and simmering regional tensions. Now, the Biden administration has made a centerpiece of its policy a return to the JCPOA. And this slide and the next one just have some of the main pieces of the JCPOA agreement. I mean, this is a fairly sophisticated agreement. There are many different categories that it covers, but the bottom line was it was supposed to be able to prevent the Iranians from producing weapons-grade uranium and increasing the amount of time it would take for Iran to break out. In other words, if it started to enrich again, how long would it take before it had enough fuel to get a nuclear weapon? Now, it might sound like, oh, okay, so the administration comes in, they want to go back to the JCPOA. Well, then they can just, overturn Trump's executive order that took the U.S. out of the agreement and negotiate on the JCPOA for a better agreement, and then it's done. It's not as easy as it sounds, though, for the United States to return to the 2015 nuclear deal for a whole host of reasons. First of all, there is significant international and domestic opposition to doing any kind of a nuclear deal with the Iranians, and in particular, going back to the terms of the JCPOA. The Israelis and the Saudis, in particular, were furious with the Obama administration for negotiating this deal. They have made very clear that they do not want the Biden administration to return to this unless they can get significant concessions out of the Iranians. There are also some of those in Congress who oppose lifting sanctions on the Iranians and oppose returning to the deal. So there is going to be some significant domestic and international opposition. A second major issue the administration will face in returning to the deal are the Iranian presidential election in June of 2020. Current Iranian President Rouhani is term limited, so he cannot run again. Of course, he was the person who was in charge when the JCPOA was negotiated. His power actually was severely eroded by the blow to his credibility when it became clear that the United States was not a trustworthy negotiating partners. The hardliners actually are very likely to win the election in June. There's a complex process for candidates who run in elections in Iran. First, they have to be approved by what's called the Guardian Council. And the Guardian Council frequently disqualifies candidates that are from more moderate factions, or at least moderate in the terms of the Iranian political spectrum. And they wholesale disqualified moderate candidates. So basically the only people left running in June of 2020 are going to be hardliners. There's also a really deep distrust in Iran of the United States because of the fact that the US abrogated the deal. Tehran has made known that it wants the Biden administration to provide it with guarantees that another administration would not withdraw the US from the JCPOA in the future. Putting that kind of a guarantee into any kind of accord, of course, is really going to aggravate Republicans in Congress. A third major problem around returning to the JCPOA is actually the sequencing of all of this. Right? So the Iranians are now also in violation of the accord, like the Americans, because the US withdrew from the agreement. So Iran's position is the United States withdrew from the accord. The United States created this situation, and therefore the United States has to lift sanctions first. And once the US lifts sanctions, then the Iranians will go back to abiding by the terms of the JCPOA. The Biden team, on the other hand, is saying the United States will return to the agreement if the Iranians return to full compliance first. And so there is going to be a kind of a tug of war between the two sides around who's going to make the first move towards compliance. The Iranians do have a point in the sense that, in fact, at the time the US withdrew from the agreement and for well over a year afterwards, the US intelligence assessment was, in fact, that the Iranians were, in fact, in full compliance with the agreement. They only started exceeding the JCPOA limits after it became clear that the United States was not only had snapped back sanctions, but was putting more sanctions on them. Each time it has violated a step in the JCPOA, it has reiterated that it would reverse those moves if the US returned to compliance. The International Atomic Energy Agency has said all along that actually the Iranians were being cautious in terms of what they were trying to violate, and that it would take approximately 2 to 3 months for the Iranians to return to compliance. And that even includes now that they've jumped to the 20% uranium enrichment. And then finally, and in many ways, this is going to turn out to be one of the more complicated parts of this whole thing. Sanctions are really complicated against the Iranians, right? So a key piece in all of this is lifting US sanctions on Iran. If you want a nuclear deal to go forward, that is absolutely going to have to happen. But the United States has layers and layers and layers of sanctions on the Iranians, not just on Iran's government, but also on key sectors of Iran's economy, on companies and firms that operate in Iran, as well as on individuals within the Iranian government, military, and nuclear sector. Not all of the sanctions that the United States has on Iran are related to its nuclear program. So for example, in 2015, when the JCPOA went into effect and US sanctions were lifted on the Iranians, only some sanctions were lifted. It was a very specific set. Other sanctions remained in place because they had nothing to do with the nuclear program. So the US also has sanctions on the Iranians related to human rights violations, its support for terrorism, and its ballistic missile program. And I would just mention the ballistic missile program was one of the biggest gaps in the JCPOA. That's why a lot of people opposed it. That is something the Biden administration would like to fix if it's able to get back into the accord with the Iranians. So it would be the JCPOA plus something having to do with the ballistic missile programs. Some sanctions that the US has on the Iranians can only be lifted if the administration can show that the individual or entity against whom those sanctions have been levied is no longer supporting the Iranian government's malign activities. So many of the most recent sanctions moves by the Trump administration cannot be easily reversed. Because otherwise the Biden administration would have to come forward and say that these particular firms and individuals actually were not engaging in activities that were counter to American national security interests. And that's most of the ones that were most recently imposed by the administration, the previous administration, were actually for non-nuclear related activities. They were for things like terrorism. The US not only has these kind of primary sanctions on the Iranians, but it also has secondary sanctions, which aim to restrict non-American companies from doing business with the Iranians. Oftentimes this impacts financial transactions. So most banks, for example, cannot do business with the Iranians if they want to do business with the Americans. Some of you may have heard that the Iranians had seized a South Korean tanker. Last month, they just recently released the crew. Actually, part of the whole thing around the seizure of that tanker is because American secondary sanctions have resulted in South Korean banks freezing nearly $7 billion in Iranian assets, and the Iranians want the money unfrozen. And the assumption is that the deal to let the crew go may be related in some way to a South Korean decision to sort of loosen the restrictions on that money in their banks. But so figuring out how sanctions are going to work against the Iranians is going to be a major task for the administration, on top of all the other kinds of opposition and sequencing questions that it's going to face. So what can the Biden administration do to ease its relations with the Iranians? First, of course, it already lifted the Muslim travel ban, which was something that the Iranians were looking for. This is something that really impacted just ordinary people. And so that kind of gesture of goodwill will go, will stand the administration in good stead. Some of the other steps that have been pointed out for the administration, the Iranians have a $5 billion loan application in front of the International Monetary Fund, which the Trump administration had opposed. They want the money to help them with COVID relief. And so many people are calling on the administration to withdraw American opposition to the IMF loan. The administration could return to a practice that the Trump administration did for a while, which was it issued waivers to the 8 countries and places, because it's 7 countries in Taiwan, who buy oil from the Iranians. And so the United States had allowed that for a while. It means the Iranians are able to earn some hard currency. The economy is in terrible straits, and as with the pressure of COVID, it really needs to be able to earn some hard currency. So that might be something else. This would be a limited lifting of one particular sanction, but a sanction that really hurts the Iranians. The administration could also start to reverse some of the Trump-era sanctions as it moves in the direction of restarting talks on the JCPOA. The Biden administration's new envoy to the Iranians, Robert Malley, had been working for the International Crisis Group during the Trump administration. The ICG is a major international think tank. And so he's written pretty extensively about how he thinks the United States and the Iranians can move back towards a nuclear agreement. One of the things that they have suggested is that there could be a 2 to 3 month timetable that is laid out by both states that have staggered steps, where each step would be separated by about 2 weeks. More or less simultaneously, the United States would lift a specific sanction, and the International Atomic Energy Agency would verify that the Iranians were back in compliance with a particular part of the JCPOA. Until by the end of those 3 months, you would have a point where the Iranians were back in compliance with the agreement, and the United States had lifted the sanctions that it was required to lift by the JCPOA. And then the two sides can begin to try to move forward to negotiate on a deal. It is clear, though, that the Biden administration is not planning to rush into anything with the Iranians. Nearly all of its major cabinet appointments in the national security and foreign policy bureaucracy have said it's going to take some time. There is concern, of course, amongst outside observers that there could be a very narrow window. In other words, do it with Rouhani in power. You don't want to have to deal with a hardline administration that's likely to come in June of 2020. So that's the situation with the Iranians. That leads me to the second major issue that the administration faces in the Persian Gulf, and that is what to do about Saudi Arabia. The current king, King Salman, is in his mid to late 80s. He is not in good health. The Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, also known as MBS, is only about 35 years old. And for all intents and purposes, he is the de facto ruler of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and has been since he became Crown Prince in 2017. The main concerns that the United States has with Saudi Arabia, or what the Biden administration has with Saudi Arabia, are its human rights record and the war in Yemen. Both of these things actually are tied together by the behavior of Mohammed bin Salman, whose reckless decisions since he has become Crown Prince and even before were not only ignored by the Trump administration, but actually supported. The administration provided a very permissive atmosphere for MBS, who has turned out to be as reckless as he is ruthless with both domestic and international opponents. A few of the major concerns for what the MBS has gotten Saudi Arabia involved in. One was the boycott campaign against Qatar. The administration, the Trump administration, made its first overseas foreign visit to Saudi Arabia. And a few days after Trump returned from Saudi Arabia, he issued this tweet about that there can be no radical ideology. And he said that leaders in the Gulf had suggested that it was Qatar that was largely responsible for the spread of these radical ideologies. Within a few days, the Saudi government had implemented a boycott campaign against the country of Qatar. It issued a lengthy list of ultimatums that included things like closing down Al Jazeera and completely reorienting its foreign policy in the direction that Saudi Arabia wanted that policy to go in. So the blockade was in effect from 2017 until the end of January of 2020. The administration actually helped get the Saudis to relift it. But outside observers had noted that the blockade effort against Qatar was embarrassingly underprepared overreach, involving ridiculous demands and no exit ramp. That it mainly harmed ordinary people who were not able to people who had family members, for example, who couldn't go from Qatar to anywhere else in the Gulf and vice versa, while at the same time not really producing any changes in Qatar's behavior. If anything, Qatar actually moved closer to the Iranians, which was one of the reasons that the Saudis were upset with Qatar. They moved closer to the Iranians and simultaneously maintain their relationship with the United States. You know, the U.S. has this massive air base that is in Qatar. By the end of the Trump administration, they were pushing the Saudis to please lift the blockade on Qatar because it had not accomplished anything. And in fact, Jared Kushner traveled to Saudi Arabia personally to talk to MBS at the end of 2020 and helped convince him to bring an end to the boycott. And while the blockade against Qatar has been lifted, there's still a great deal of diplomatic work that is going to need to go, going to need to happen moving forward to repair the ties between Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia in particular. And again, the basic dispute between Saudi Arabia and Qatar has in no way been addressed during this time period. Another example of MBS's recklessness was in late 2017, where he literally kidnapped the Lebanese prime minister, who had been called to Saudi Arabia. He thought he was going to go hunting in the desert with Mohammed bin Salman. Instead, he was arrested. He was held incommunicado for several days. He was forced to resign. by the Saudi government. The Lebanese refused to accept his resignation, and eventually there was so much international pressure on the Saudis that they were forced to release Prime Minister Harari, and he went back to Lebanon for a hero's welcome. But I mean, it was just a really badly considered idea. You do not kidnap other countries' leaders after you've invited them to visit. And it was just a sign of the way in which Mohammed bin Salman frequently takes reckless actions without thinking about what his exit strategy is going to be, or whether or not these actions are even going to accomplish what they are hoping would actually take place. And then, of course, there is the war in Yemen. This is probably the biggest area of dispute right now between Saudi Arabia and the United States. The war is now entering its 6th year. It is considered to be the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and has been the world's worst humanitarian crisis for the last several years. The war is completely stalemated on the ground, and the battlefield is now even more fractured than it was when the war began in 2015. This is another one of these sort of Mohammed bin Salman adventures. When the Houthis, which is a rebel movement, moved against the government of the Republic of Yemen, Saudi Arabia intervened on behalf of the Yemeni government. It began and continues an air campaign, which it undertook in cooperation with United Arab Emirates and 7 or 8 other largely Sunni Muslim countries in the Middle East. At the time, Mohammed bin Salman argued that Saudi Arabia would be able to win this war quickly, that it would be able to defeat the Houthis, that this would be a major foreign policy win for them. And at the time that the war started, the Obama administration was in office. And Obama was trying to get the JCPOA into place. The Saudis were losing their minds over the idea that the Americans were going to sign an Iranian nuclear deal. And so the Obama administration made the decision that they were going to support the Saudi-led air campaign in Yemen as kind of a sop to them, to soften the blow of the JCPOA. This involved US arms sales to Saudi Arabia, the provision of intelligence, diplomatic support for them. And at the time, Joe Biden was supportive of this policy towards the war in Yemen. By the time the Obama administration left office, however, the US had suspended sales of precision-guided missiles to Saudi Arabia because of the damage that was taking place in Yemen. Saudi Arabia has been widely condemned for the air campaign that it has carried out. It has repeatedly struck non-military targets and killed thousands of civilians. Reportedly, there have been 21,000 coalition airstrikes against non-military targets, resulting in over 18,500 civilian casualties, plus extensive property damage. The coalition, the Saudi-led coalition, has bombed hospitals, marketplaces, mosques, farms, detention centers, and even school buses. Human Rights Watch in 2020 said it had documented at least 90 apparently unlawful Saudi-led coalition airstrikes against Yemen. As one person noted, the United States has helped to build one of the best equipped and worst performing militaries in the world. Talking about the Saudi military, as the incompetent airstrikes in Yemen have clearly demonstrated. The Trump administration continued the Obama policies of support, but they began to supply weapons again after the Obama administration had suspended those sales. This, by the way, is just a map of the control of what is happening in Yemen. The Houthi areas, the Houthis are aligned with the Iranians. The pinkish areas are the government areas, that is aligned with the coalition led by Saudi Arabia. Even though it looks like the Yemeni government controls most of Yemen. In fact, the smaller map is there so you can see this. Most of the area that it controls is very sparsely populated. 80% of Yemen's population actually lives in the areas that the Houthis control. The Houthis control the capital of Yemen and nearly all of its most important ports, with the exception of the port of Aden in the south. And of course, there is a jihadi presence in Yemen. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is active here. There is also an Islamic State affiliate that is active in Yemen. And unfortunately, the Houthis initially had been fighting against AQAP and the Islamic State. But as the war has continued, they have had to kind of back off attempting to do that because they are too involved in fighting against the Saudi-led coalition. On multiple occasions, the US Congress has attempted to change American policies towards Saudi Arabia. Trump actually rarely vetoed anything, but he did veto these congressional efforts to stop US involvement in the war in Yemen. And these were, again, this was bipartisan in Congress. Republicans and Democrats agree the United States needs to stop what it's doing in Yemen because the Saudis are committing war crimes on a fairly regular basis using American equipment. In the very last months of the administration, Trump pushed through a deal for another $500 million in precision-guided munitions to Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia spends more money than almost any other country in the world in its military, but it has gotten itself into basically an unwinnable war in Yemen with catastrophic humanitarian consequences for the population that lives there. And then in the very last days of the Trump administration, they designated the Houthi rebel movement as a foreign terrorist organization. This has serious complications for the delivery of humanitarian assistance into Yemen, because it means that anybody who engages in transactions or activities that involve the Houthis or any entity the Houthi owns directly or indirectly by 50% or more, right, falls afoul of American sanctions. And the Houthis control the territory where 80% of the Yemeni populations live. They are the de facto government and control the government institutions in most of the area where Yemenis live. The reaction to this was swift and overwhelmingly negative. In fact, the Trump administration had thought about declaring the Houthis a foreign terrorist organization multiple times in previous years and had never gone forward with it because of the opposition from humanitarian groups. But the belief is that the reason the administration did this in the last days was because they wanted to show how much pressure they were actually putting on the Iranians. But the administration rushed this through. So for example, you need a license under a designation of a foreign terrorist organization if you were going to supply humanitarian assistance in that area. And while the administration did supply the licenses for the United Nations and most humanitarian organizations, it did not have the time to write a license for private sector importers. 80 to 90% of Yemen's food is imported, and a significant portion of that is going through commercial supporters. And this is why there has been such a backlash against the decision to label the Houthis as an FTO. So Yemen is a big issue for Saudi Arabia and the Biden administration. The other one is Saudi Arabia's dismal human rights record. There is an enormous amount of repression that has been undertaken by Mohammed bin Salman since he came to power. He has crushed his rivals and his opponents And Saudi Arabia has emerged as a leading practitioner of what's been called transnational repression. In other words, not only does it go after people who are living in Saudi Arabia, but it goes after Saudis who are living in exile abroad, including in the United States and Canada and other Western countries. Transnational repression manifests itself in physical threats against dissidents, the use of spyware, violence, rendition, digital threats, and the imprisonment of family and friends as a way to try to blackmail exiles into coming back to Saudi Arabia. We had an early sign of how MBS's rule was going to go when he actually became the crown prince. He displaced Mohammed bin Nayef, who the long-term crown prince, and right after he became crown prince, he had about 400 prominent members of the royal family, businessmen, etc., arrested and held at the Ritz-Carlton. Reportedly, individuals were only able to leave if they signed away portions of their wealth over to Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi state. Ostensibly, this was about corruption, and there was some support for this in Saudi Arabia because of the sense that there is a great deal of corruption amongst the royal family, but nonetheless, even now they continue to hold senior members of the royal family in an effort to ensure that nobody challenges his rule. Mohammed bin Nayef, the former crown prince, was actually arrested in March of 2020. He had actually been under house arrest since he had been deposed in 2017. Nobody has been allowed to see him, and there are serious concerns about his health. And what kinds of steps Mohammed bin Salman is planning to take against him in the future, because there's been a coordinated social media campaign that's been carried out against him in Saudi Arabia just over the last several weeks. Then, of course, there was the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who was lured to the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, where he was strangled and then dismembered with a bone saw. His body has never been recovered. The CIA has issued a report in which it says that it is with a high degree of confidence that Mohammed bin Salman ordered the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. For a while, Mohammed bin Salman was kind of a pariah in global circles because of the perception that he had ordered this hit on Khashoggi. But at major G20 summits back to back, first he is embraced by Vladimir Putin, and then he is embraced by Donald Trump. These handshakes signal that Mohammed bin Salman was back in the good graces of the most important members of the international community. There is still enormous pressure to try to hold Mohammed bin Salman to account for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Another example of the human rights abuses that are being undertaken by the regime that is similar to the murder of Khashoggi is the targeting of Saad al-Jabri, who is one of the leading intelligence officials in Saudi Arabia when Mohammed bin Nayef, the previous crown prince, had been in charge of counterterrorism efforts in Saudi Arabia. This is an instance where, as he's been targeted by Mohammed bin Salman, the US government, even under the Trump administration, publicly claimed to his defense, saying that he was a good friend to the United States, a valued partner, and that he had saved thousands of American lives through his cooperation on counterterrorism efforts. There are reports that Mohammed bin Salman sent the Tiger Brigade after al-Jabri in Canada, and that the Canadians, because Khashoggi's assassination had already happened, they became suspicious when this large group of Saudis came in carrying equipment that they didn't think they would need for a stay in Canada, so they turned the team around. Al-Jabri is now suing Mohammed bin Salman in US courts under the Alien Tort Act. But in addition, his two children, who were still in Saudi Arabia when he went into exile in 2017, have been arrested by the Saudi government, and they are in incommunicado detention. No one knows where they are or what has happened to them. There's been continued pressure by the international community to try to get Mohammed bin Salman to provide some information about Saeed al-Jabri. As the Trump administration was leaving office and wanted the Saudis to end the blockade of Qatar, Kushner and Trump apparently talked about the possibility of granting Mohammed bin Salman sovereign immunity in the case that has been launched against him by al-Jabri about this assassination effort. There doesn't seem to be very much evidence that the Saudis can bring against al-Jabri for the charges, that mainly corruption, that they've offered. Where there was an Interpol warrant issued by Saudi Arabia for his arrest this past summer, and Interpol denied it. They said there was no evidence to support that. Another major human rights case that has come up in, again, very recently, has to do with the arrests of women's activists in Saudi Arabia, in particular, Jan al-Hathlul. There are a number of women who were pushing for the right to drive in Saudi Arabia, and were longtime activists. They would take pictures of themselves behind the wheel of cars, which is what al-Hathlul is doing in this photo. The month before MBS lifted the ban on women driving, he arrested a dozen top female activists, the women that had been pushing for this change. They were held for at least 10 months without charges in incommunicado detention. Over the next, ever since they have been arrested in May of 2018, there have been accusations that many of them, and in particular, Jan al-Hathlul, have been held in solitary confinement and subjected to torture, including rape by Saudi officials. Al-Hathlul was sent to a terrorism court in Saudi Arabia at the end of 2020. You can see the charges that have been lodged against her, which included things like speaking to journalists and meeting with diplomats, trying to get a job at the United Nations. These were all, again, these are terrorism charges that have been brought against her. In one sign, though, that the Saudis realized that with the new administration coming in, that there is going to be difficulties with their human rights record, they suspended at least part of the sentence. And so because she's already been in prison since May of 2018, she potentially could be released within the next several months. Another case of this kind of transnational repression is Omar Abdulaziz, who is a journalist who was in Canada, who was very close to Jamal Khashoggi. His brothers and 20 of his friends have been arrested and are being held in house arrest in Saudi Arabia. The Canadians have reported that his phones have been infected with spyware that has been connected back to the Saudis. And it believes that his conversations with Jamal Khashoggi in the 2 weeks before Khashoggi's assassination were actually being monitored by the Saudi government. He was recently warned by the Saudi or by the Canadian police that they believe there was going to be a assassination attempt against him carried out by the Saudis in Canada. So, I mean, there are numerous instances of human rights abuses that the Biden administration and the officials in its top things have made very clear that they want to reset the US relationship with Saudi Arabia around this. There's already been clear movement on this. Biden issued this statement on the second anniversary of Khashoggi's murder in October of 2020. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, released a tweet that was very critical of the sentencing of Jan al-Hathlul. Avril Haines, the Director of National Intelligence, committed to the Senate that she would release the report that the US government has written on Khashoggi's assassination. This is the report that says with high confidence, US intelligence believes Mohammed bin Salman ordered this. The report is not classified, but the Trump administration refused to release it. And there's been a lot of pressure in Congress to do that. And so the administration has already said they are planning to do that. Almost as soon as they came into office, they put a pause on these major arms deals to the UAE and to Saudi Arabia, and they're going to review them before they determine whether or not they're going to move forward. And on January 23rd, they put a hold on the designation of the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization, at least until the end of February, to continue to allow, until the end of February, humanitarian assistance to be able to get into Yemen. And the expectation is that the administration will try to completely lift this designation of the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization. So with Saudi Arabia, the Biden administration needs to balance US national security concerns with other considerations, such as humanitarian and human rights issues. Among the things that the administration could do moving forward, they could raise the profile of the war in Yemen, actually put more effort into finding a negotiated diplomatic solution to this, insist that Saudi Arabia lift the blockade that it has on Yemen, which is restricting humanitarian access. This would be important for not just the US, but also Saudi Arabia. Yemen is a quagmire. It has no exit strategy, and it is in a stalemate. And so the United States would be helping Mohammed bin Salman, actually, if it can help find a way to bring a ceasefire, or even if it's just a pause for humanitarian access in Yemen, and then try to get a more fulsome settlement there. It can engage in greater scrutiny of weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. Especially, it could prevent the sale of offensive weapons to Saudi Arabia. It could ensure that US weapons that are sold to Saudi Arabia are not used in Yemen. It could ensure that Saudi Arabia is not engaging with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. There are very credible reports that this is actually happening. But so use weapon sales to Saudi Arabia as a way to put pressure on them to do something about Yemen and to repair its human rights abuses. The administration could end the permissive atmosphere around Mohammed bin Salman's rule. They could push for the release of prisoners. They need to make clear to Mohammed bin Salman that there will be consequences if he continues this kind of reckless engagement and abuse of human rights. Mohammed bin Salman is turning into a junior Vladimir Putin, and the US should rein him in now while it still has the opportunity. Mohammed bin Salman is the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, and he will become the king of Saudi Arabia when King Salman dies. So the US needs to come to some kind of an agreement and understanding with Mohammed bin Salman about the parameters of the kinds of behavior that the United States is willing to tolerate, and that if he violates those, that there will be consequences in terms of, for example, denying visas to Saudi officials, freezing Saudi bank accounts, not selling offensive weapons to the Saudis. The US has a whole panoply of targeted sanctions that it's been using against the Iranians to try to change their behavior. Some of those sanctions could just as easily be leveled against Saudi Arabia to try to send the message to moderate what Mohammed bin Salman is doing. So in conclusion, there are clearly plenty of challenges ahead in the Persian Gulf for the Biden team. There are no easy answers for what to do about Iran or Saudi Arabia, especially because that rivalry between the two of them is so intertwined with the question about what the United States should do. And of course, I have not even addressed the question of trying to heal the rift in the GCC over the Qatar blockade, the need for reform of the repressive government in Bahrain, the need for the US to manage its relationship with the Iraqis, whose parliament has voted that the Americans need to withdraw all of their troops. The US needs to find an end game in Syria. It needs to craft policies towards repressive governments in Egypt and Turkey, and it needs to deal with the fragility of Lebanon. And further afield in the Middle East, there's always the question of what is going on in Libya. At a minimum, with the Biden administration, what you can say is at least this is an experienced team that has come into office. There's no need for them. There's no learning curve here. They don't need to learn the names or the relationships or the histories. They're well aware of what's going on. But they're going to need to bring all of that experience to bear if they're going to be able to find a way to navigate these pressures for the United States in the Persian Gulf. So with that, I would be happy to take any questions that anybody might have. Or any comments anybody might have.
I'd like to know how many US troops are in Saudi Arabia right now and how secure are they?
So the United States has a relatively small number of troops in Saudi Arabia because there's enormous domestic backlash within Saudi Arabia to having the presence of American troops on their soil. That's why the US has such large facilities in Kuwait, in Qatar, in Bahrain. The United States has, though, over the last year, been working with Saudi Arabia about the possibility that the US could have access to some facilities that are on the western side of Saudi Arabia. So in other words, the coast that's closer to the Red Sea, because of concerns that if there are hostilities with the Iranians, that the US's forward positions in places like Bahrain and Qatar are very vulnerable to Iranian attack. And so would the Americans be able to move across Saudi Arabia and have temporary use of some facilities in the Red Sea? And that they do seem to be negotiating that access right now, putting those kinds of contingency plans into place. But mainly the United States tries to keep its forces elsewhere in the Persian Gulf to avoid aggravating domestic sensitivities in Saudi Arabia. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I was trying to type, but I can say it faster than I can type.
That's
I have a little military background, but it's Air Force. It's not infantry or anything. But in our text, they quote Martin Indyk, I-N-D-Y-K.
Yep, that's right.
Saying it's not worth it anymore in the Persian Gulf. And so I don't want to put you on the spot, but he's saying pull out, and we have enough in the Fifth Fleet and the over-the-horizon capabilities of aircraft that we can project our power as we need to without actually being in the Persian Gulf, and it gets us out of some of the complications. I don't mean that as a challenge. I'm trying to offer. Can you speak that directly?
Yeah, sure. No, absolutely. I mean, this is part of the sort of larger conversation that is going on as the change in administrations about whether or not the United States is going to back away from the Persian Gulf specifically, but actually the Middle East in general, right? Because of this just basic fatigue. And so there has been some concern, as I said in response to the earlier question, about how close, for example, the airbase is in Qatar to the Iranians in the event that there were ever hostilities. And in fact, at one point, the U.S. had to relocate CENTCOM headquarters back to the United States for a short period of time, right, when tensions had gotten particularly high. It seems unlikely, though, that the United States could completely replace the base it has in the Persian Gulf with bases. The Fifth Fleet in Bahrain is one of those things. So, Bahrain has a repressive government. It's a minority Shia or a Sunni regime over a majority Shia population. There was an uprising there in 2011 that was brutally put down by the regime, and a lot of pressure on the US to do something, in favor of democracy and human rights there. And, activists and advocates who work on this issue said, look, you couldn't talk to anybody in Congress about it. No one wanted to hear about it, because as soon as you say Bahrain, the first thing they say is the US Fifth Fleet. There is nothing that is going to budge the US out of Bahrain, right? If anything, the United States is actually pouring more money into the bases that it has in Bahrain. The Persian Gulf is just strategically centrally located for U.S. forces, because it gives you the ability to project into East Africa, into up into the Fertile Crescent, and then all the way out into Afghanistan. It's hard to have an idea of where else you could get that kind of reach. NATO has a major air base at Incirlik in Turkey, but of course, U.S.-Turkish relations are not good, to put it politely. And so it's not as if the U.S. can just relocate its Qatar air base into Incirlik. So I think one of the counter arguments to Indic's position is, as much as the US might like to get out, it isn't clear that it has better options someplace else. And other places are unstable too. I mean, if you think about, okay, well, if the Persian Gulf's bad, why don't we go to the other side, to the Red Sea side? Except Eritrea and Ethiopia and Somalia are a mess. Right? In fact, the US for a long time had its radio communications headquarters for the entire world. Its satellite communications were in Eritrea, but it removed that position decades and decades ago. And now, of course, I mean, there's literally a war going on the border between Eritrea and Ethiopia. So short of just simply withdrawing all of our military assets from that area, it isn't clear where the US could easily go if it leaves Qatar.
Thank
or
you.
any of those other places.
Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. So there is a question in the chat. Let's see, from Annette. Can you please comment on the dichotomy between the realities of the regime and their attempts at appearing to modernize the country? Yes. So when Mohammed bin Salman first came onto the scene in Saudi Arabia, he was very, very young, like 28. He had good ties with people in the West. He talked a lot about wanting to modernize the economy, wanting to loosen social strictures, needing to move Saudi Arabia into the future, et cetera. There were some really complimentary columns that were written about him. I remember Tom Friedman in the New York Times said really nice things about Mohammed bin Salman very early on. And at first, when he arrested all those people, when he took control, first it was sort of like, okay, well, yeah, many of them probably were engaged in corruption. Maybe the way he did this wasn't great, but there's a big problem with corruption in Saudi Arabia. And it was pretty popular domestically. Well, okay, so maybe you let that go. But then it just started to pile up. And it was like, okay, well, the war in Yemen becomes a disaster. The blockade of Qatar ends up as another quagmire. He becomes increasingly emboldened in his abuses. And he has made changes in Saudi Arabia. There's no denying that. He has some modernization ideas, like they're talking about this sort of very futuristic city that they're planning to build on the Red Sea coast of Saudi Arabia, that people are literally putting tens of billions of dollars into this place. There is a what is it, like the Riyadh exhibition just opened a couple of days ago in Saudi Arabia, and a huge number of companies have gone in there because it's clear that international business and investors think you can make a lot of money in Saudi Arabia. He has loosened restrictions on the mixing of the sexes. He has allowed women to drive. He has tried to rein in the religious leadership to be less extreme. There has been a project to revise the textbooks in Saudi Arabia to take out the worst of the anti-Semitic and anti-Western screeds that were part of that. But all of that being said, is you have to then balance that with the other side, which is Mohammed bin Salman's policies mean that Saudi Arabia's human rights record looks just like Iran's. In terms of how many journalists they have in jail, in terms of restrictions on internet freedom, in terms of civil and political liberties, in terms of gender equality, you go right down the list. Saudi Arabia and Iran have almost identical profiles. And I do just want to point out, I mean, sometimes this makes me insane. He gets all this credit for allowing women to drive. Just for a minute, just think about women driving. That's your big. He didn't remove the male guardian system, where women still need the permission of a husband or a father or a brother to, for example, leave the country. And so, you know, yes, he let women drive, but that's because they really need women into the workforce in Saudi Arabia. But he hasn't changed the fundamentals around men's control over women's lives. And so I do think that Mohammed bin Salman is dangerous, and he is the kind of autocratic ruler that the United States needs to reckon with early. You know, the Trump administration always said, we're just selling so many weapons to the Saudis. They buy so many weapons. The Iranians bought a whole lot of weapons from the United States in the 1960s and 1970s, and the United States ignored the Shah's human rights record. We are still paying for that mistake. And so, you know, the United States, I think, should think a little bit more strategically. We don't have to cut Saudi Arabia off like we have with the Iranians, but we shouldn't be giving Mohammed bin Salman a blank check and just say, oh, you want to murder dissidents who live in Canada? Okay, that's okay. Right? As long as women can drive, that's fine. So I think he gets a lot of credit for pretty minor reforms, especially when you balance it off. I mean, the humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen can't really be underscored. And this is largely Saudi Arabia's fault. Right now, the Houthis have also committed plenty of war crimes, but it's the Saudis that are doing the aerial bombardment of the country. And so my concern is more that Mohammed bin Salman is a budding Vladimir Putin, and we need to make it clear that that's just not going to be acceptable to the United States.
I would agree with you. I guess what my question was more, why are people not realizing this? You know, I mean, like 60 Minutes did this, I thought, really flattering fluff piece on him about a year ago. And I just, at the time, I thought, why are they not looking more at the, you know, much harder at the bad stuff he's doing? I guess that's my question, is why are people not noticing this?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question and a very fair point. I think part of it really was when the United States is not providing any kind of global leadership around questions of human rights, there really isn't anybody else who's capable of stepping into that position. And the US abdicated its leadership for the entirety of the Trump administration. I mean, the fact that the administration couldn't even criticize Mohammed bin Salman over the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, right? again, it creates a permissive environment that then allows others to think, well, if the United States isn't going to do anything about it, we shouldn't inconvenience ourselves or our economic interests with the Saudis by doing anything about it either. I do think it will, having an administration saying that they want to hold Saudi Arabia to account is going to make a difference. Because there's a huge sort of global human rights movement that has been organizing on behalf of people like Khashoggi and the women activists who've been arrested, et cetera, who are just looking for a partner that would be willing to help them in that. But I agree, you do see a lot of these really, oh, the young dashing crown prince of Saudi Arabia, and a lot less interest in what conditions are actually like.
What is the motivation for Iran to accept the limitations of the JOCCA when one of their main regional enemies, Israel, is generally presumed to already possess nuclear arms?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's economic pain. I mean, the sanctions so there are US, UN, and EU sanctions on the Iranians. The Americans have more sanctions and more wide-ranging sanctions than anybody, but Iran, for all intents and purposes, since the, with the Trump administration snapping back sanctions from the JCPOA, the Iranians, their currency has plummeted. Inflation has skyrocketed. Their gross domestic product, which actually had gone up for several years in a row fairly robustly when it first went into, when the agreement first went in. Once the sanctions snapped back and the US put increased pressure, it has seen significant negative growth rates over the last number of years. And so, I mean, its ability to export oil has been almost completely strangled off by the secondary sanctions. It doesn't have access to any of its assets abroad, because if they're in a foreign bank, if that bank lets the Iranians have them, then they can't do business with the US, or worse, they might be subject to prosecution by the United States for breaking the sanctions. So that is the leverage that the international community has over the Iranians, is economic pain. And of course, this impacts the regime's ability to maintain itself in power and to maintain at least some level of legitimacy. So, I mean, that's the main pressure on the Iranians. One thing I would point out too is that, the Iranians have been pretty cautious over the last several months, anticipating the Biden administration coming into office. I mean, there were real concerns that there was going to be some kind of a military confrontation between the US and the Iranians in late December, early January, because that's the anniversary of the death of Qasem Soleimani. The Iranians didn't really do anything. So they seem to be, and then they let the South Korean crew go the other day. They seem to be sending at least some signals to the Biden administration that they would be willing to talk. The Iranians have to be careful, though, not to overplay their hand. They might think they have leverage over the administration because the administration wants to get back into the JCPOA. It was a big campaign promise, et cetera. And so they might think, oh, well, we can make the Americans give all the concessions first, and then we'll go back into compliance. But it seems fairly clear that the Biden administration's idea is that Iran goes first, or you do that kind of, interlocked step by step, so nobody can claim that they went first. So Tehran has to be careful that they don't overestimate what their negotiating leverage is over the next several months, or we could really miss an opportunity to bring everybody to the table. And actually getting negotiations started with even if it's back channel with the Iranians would also be helpful for Yemen, because the Iranians do back the Houthis. And so those two things are linked in. Progress in one might make progress in the other area easier.
Okay, it's almost 8 o'clock. So I want to thank everybody for coming to our virtual Great Decisions program. Thank you, Dr. Doherty. This is very informative, very good. Lots of stuff to digest.
Yeah.
So just a reminder. Yeah, yes.
I appreciate everybody's attention. I know how weird this is. I've been teaching online since March of last year. I know it's hard to pay attention and to listen. I hope my slides were at least a little bit more lively than the standard. I was hoping to give everybody something to look at, but in any case, again, I really appreciate your attention and for taking time out this evening to come to the virtual Great Decisions series. And I want to thank Jennifer again for all the arrangements and for asking me to come again this year.
And just a reminder, next week, we will have Dr. Pablo Toro, also of Beloit College, speaking about Brexit and the EU. Again, another really kind of complicated topic. My brain will explode, but I hope everybody can join us for that. So thank you. Thank you for coming.
Sure. If anybody has any questions, Jennifer has my email address. You're welcome to get in touch with her. It's on the Beloit website too. You're welcome to get in touch if you'd like. Thanks.
Thank you. Good evening.
Bye, Jennifer.
Bye.